So welcome everybody to the monthly Café gathering for Radical Joy for Hard Times. And as ever, we're going to start the hour with bringing ourselves into the virtual space of this cafe, the cafe that we've now really built up for all things radical joy, making beauty in wounded spaces. And around us now are books that our guests have written, music that our guests have played, and we are in this space together with fellow people, fellow adventurers, and people who have experienced the Rad Joy ethos. And so we sit there with our warm cup of tea or our coffee or hot chocolate, and we pull up our pew in our favorite chair. And as we do so, we notice that today Daniel Foor is with us. Welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Welcome, Trevi, and everybody who's listening or will be listening. And as we sit here in the cafe, we first of all turn to the east, and we welcome in the hawk of the dawn light that will hover above us, giving us insight, overview, and a sense of perspective that guides our intuition and guides our minds so that we can explore what's inside our minds with the clarity that the hawk will give us. Welcome to the circle. And then we turn to the south, the great fire of the midsummer sun between the antlers of the stag. And he gives us his fire and his fecundity and his exploration of his youth and his power. He invites us to explore the energy of our conversation and what moves us to create in the heat of the midsummer sun. Welcome. We turn now to the west, and the sun is dipping down across the ocean where the water holds the salmon of wisdom, the deeper soul reaches of our ancestors and of the wisdom of our community. May the salmon guide us with what we already know, what will come through us of our ancestors, and those deeper reaches that connect us to where we come from. Welcome. And we turn to the north. The Great Bear, both in the sky as stars and also in her cave, resting in the darkness, waiting in the earth, where we feel the solidity of her being, of her patience, and of holding everything in waiting for what is to come. Great Bear, welcome. And so with all our four directions guiding our conversation, we turn to the center and we look again at each other and all of the people gathered in the circle. And we are so looking forward to listening to the conversation as it unfolds. So welcome again, Daniel, and Trevi, I hand it over to you.
Thank you, Harriet. That was really beautiful. We're very, very pleased today to introduce Daniel Foor, who has carved out a very, very, a path really all his own, as far as I know anyway. After having studied with Indigenous teachers of many different groups all over the world, he created a pathway called Ancestral Medicine. And he's written a book also called Ancestral Medicine, and he has an organization by the same name. And the work is to help people get in touch with their ancestors in order to heal present life difficulties and traumas, and to really get in touch with the ancestors as important guides. And he's even expanded that work, which we'll also talk about, to bring in the non-human ancestors, not just the human ones. So he lives in North Carolina with his family, his wife and his 2 children. And Daniel, we're so happy to welcome you today.
Thanks so much. It's good to be here, Trevor and Harriet. Thanks.
So I want to start, most people, I think, assume that your ancestor is in the past. Maybe you have a photograph of them. Maybe you know their names or their lineage. But the past is in the past as far as the people who preceded you. And also your own life is in the past. What's done is done. But your approach seems to be completely opposite to that. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, sure. For one, just for context, my own ancestors of blood lineage are early English and German settler colonialists in North America. And so that's who I'm down lineage from. I live in Western North Carolina. It's traditional Cherokee lands. And so everything and everyone is happening in a certain place. And that includes the human culture and the human lineages and the tough histories that we're embedded in. So that's briefly something about where I'm speaking from. But to start in a more theoretical frame for just a second, the epistemology, the way that the kinds of knowledge that we tend to see as legitimate in at least dominant Western culture and paradigms, sees other living humans as alive, but not mountains, not the dead, the spirits or souls of the ancestors, not the planets or stars or deities, not in the same way. And it's super narrow and limiting, because to be alive really is to relate and to be responsive. And in that way, it's a very normal kind of thing to affirm that the ancestors are alive by virtue of the fact that we can continue to relate with them. And when I say the ancestors, a lot of folks think of the last few generations of people they know something about, their names, their stories, or where my recent people are from, something like that, for sure. And our ancestors, in a larger sense, the vast majority of them lived before remembered names. They are, we don't know the specifics of their lives, really. They're more of a group or collective energy. But they absolutely dwell in the present insofar as we can continue to relate with them. And this means also that the historical harms and troubles that we're trying to work out culturally, hopefully we're trying, also exist in the present. A friend in California, Ohlone person, an indigenous person in North America, shared with me once something that stuck with me, that from his perspective at least, we're still in the moment of first contact. And what I took that to mean, at least I believe it's what he meant, is like, because there wasn't, by and large, an etiquette and respect that occurred when European or especially European colonialists arrived in the Americas, we're still kind of frozen in that moment to a degree. Like you're at a party, someone starts talking to you and you're like, wait a minute, you don't even say hello. I'm still back at this interaction that didn't happen. And so it's one example of this principle that time is more relational than linear, and how both the blessings that we can draw on and the troubles that we haven't yet metabolized continue to live in the present until we've faced them and addressed them in some way. So that applies personally on a big systemic level all throughout. Yeah.
Okay, so I just have a lot of questions about that, but about what you just said. It's fascinating. But I want to go back to your own pathway first. How did all of this start for you? Was it a question? Was it something that happened? Was it something that you learned from one of the teachers that you were studying with? Like, what was that pivot?
Yeah, I wasn't raised with any kind of framework for religion or spirituality. I was marginally Methodist because I sought it out and was interested in all that, even as a kid. And then I had some LSD as a teenager, and that was very impactful. And It wasn't just that, but it was a direct, for me, at least at the time, part of what came from the experience of psychoactives was a experience of direct contact with something that was bigger than me, that wasn't only me, that I didn't have any framework for. Like, whoa, there's a lot going on that I don't have any map for. So I started reading even more about religion and shamanism and ritual and all that, and had the good fortune even as a teenager to connect with living teachers of shamanic practice, survival forms of European paganism and things like that. And they did well by me. They helped me to reclaim a framework to directly relate with the spirits of animals and plants and deities, and ultimately my own ancestors. And that the ability to navigate direct relationships with the others set me up for a lifetime of being guided and moved along in a winding, circuitous path of trying to find a sense of belonging as a white American kid from the suburbs of Ohio, where it's culturally pretty bleak in a lot of ways. And so I've been participating actively, consciously with different teachers and traditions since then. I'm also a doctor of psychology and a licensed marriage and family therapist. So it was also a very grounding move in my own path, because there's a lot of folks involved in ritual and spirituality that could benefit from what's good about psychology. And so I'm glad I made that move. But ultimately, I'm a ritualist who has a psychological sensibility and cares a lot about history and culture and justice and international affairs and how we're navigating all that.
In your book, you make a point of saying that anybody can be in touch with your ancestors. You don't have to be an indigenous person. You don't have to be a shaman. You don't have to have some kind of special extrasensory gifts. So if somebody was interested in starting out this path with you, how would that go? What's the process? How does it begin?
Yeah, it can look a lot of ways. If sometimes folks have already experienced direct contact from their ancestors, or things have just been happening, or they have training from other backgrounds and all that. So people come from lots of different angles. But the approach that I encourage which is specifically a process of healing and repair with one's blood lineage ancestors. Now, there are lots of other kinds of ancestors to relate with, and all different reasons to do that, and different complexities to who you might approach that you're not related to by blood. But it's my bias that it's good to include a cycle of work and cleanup, if needed, with one's blood lineage ancestors. That's ideally part of the process. And for that work, I recommend approaching with some level of ritual safety or discernment. And in that way, the initial assessment of what's going on with your ancestors and the connection with older ancestral guides and teachers tends to be a bit structured for the intent of establishing ritual safety. Because the dead, like the living, are not inherently safe. If I said, yeah, living people are great, you should relate with some of them, that's a really generic kind of guidance, right? And so the ancestors, the dead generally, are require discernment. And if we don't have a framework that we've received to navigate all that, it can be useful to apply a little bit of structure and engage a little bit of teaching and guidance up front. And so that the method, if you will, that I've developed and teach and train others to guide is about establishing that ritual safety, with the primary intent of helping people as quickly and as deeply as possible to just come into direct relationship with their own ancestors. And the last thing I'll say about that is that there's a strange, unhelpful kind of taboo around taking in support with spirituality or matters like that can occur. Like as a guy, I'm supposed to apparently just know how to fix cars. At least if you ask my dad. I don't know about that at all. I've taken no interest in it. Respect to people of all genders who know how to fix cars. But it's an example of like this domain of life that actually requires a little bit of training and learning to know how to navigate. It's not innate, it's learnable. And something like relating safely with the dead is actually in that category as well. There are things about it that can absolutely be learned and ways to establish safety. And it's okay to invite a little bit of support up front on that to get some traction. Yeah.
So I'd love to hear a specific story, like something that happened with you or with somebody that you've worked with, where they have worked with their ancestors and there was some kind of a transformation or a righting of a wrong or a healing of a wound.
There's so many different examples. You'd ask that, and I kind of get a little paralyzed at the question itself. So I'm going to keep it more on a thematic level, I guess. Is one thing I've seen happen a lot is that people who acted in harmful ways during life, actually after death, can undergo a process of healing that allows for a deep shift in relationship that never would have been possible during life. And that sometimes people end up with the parent they never had and wished that they had after that person dies, and goes through a whole process of healing, which doesn't automatically happen. And there's a kind of intimacy and realness that can develop at that point. It's also sometimes the case that the ancestors return in the form of our children. And so we're caring for little ancestors that have come back, and they're like, here we are again. And the folks who are wishing to call in children for their lives sometimes can find that coming into relationship with the ancestors supports that prayer if it's something they want. Also, especially for folks, and this is really all of us, but not all of us to the same degree, who are from diverse ancestral origin places or multiracial or multi-ethnic in ways that embody historic tensions, like people who are both German and German Jewish, or people who are European and African ancestored, and however it might be. There are many different examples we could reach for. Sometimes what can happen is when someone comes into relationship with those lineages on their own terms, like within group, and there's healing with one's, let's say, African lineages and one's European lineages, that sets up the possibility for an engagement between those lineages that is able to face and start to metabolize some of the historic harms that have happened as they live in the body of that person. Because in that way, our very bodies are the epicenter of all this historical trouble. And when the ancestors themselves are in a more healed condition than they were sometimes even when they were on Earth, there's a possibility for real shift. And so it's less of a burden and more of a unifying thing to be of diverse ancestries. So, but those are more general themes that can happen, but I don't have a single story to easily reach for. Yeah.
Well, when I asked you the question, then I thought of one that happened to me, is that I had a very distant relationship with my own father. He was very abusive to my mother. And 30 or more years after he died, I was fasting in the desert. And one of my guides suggested that I ask my father to tell me his life story. And so I found a little creosote bush and a heart-shaped rock, and I put the heart between us. And then I said, okay, Dad, tell me your story. I knew the facts in a rough way, but what emerged was his story. And I spoke out loud. And I understood him through that, whatever it was, hour, in a way that I had never understood him in his life. And it completely changed how I have felt about him ever since.
Yeah.
It was remarkable.
It's like that. In the call just yesterday for the Ancestral Healing course I'm guiding, the main question I brought to people is, what's in the field between you and your people? Meaning, how do you see them and how do they see you? And in that perception of one another, are you allowing for them to change And are they allowing for you to change? Is there actual, are you current with your people? And what happens so often is, because we don't have a framework for ongoing relationship, when someone dies, they get frozen in state. And there's a sense that they can't change. This is the same, it's a point of intersection with essentially abolitionists like ethics and culture that's recognizes that we need to make repairs. We need to not live in a punitive, like carceral kind of ethic that wants to freeze people in state as bad people. But instead, there's a need to somehow stay in relationship, to seek to allow for people's healing and growth and change. And this same ethic applies with the ancestors. It doesn't serve anybody for us to be like, well, those are bad people, unlike me, and therefore I put them in the bad people category, and then that's just going to work out well over time. So yeah.
So you mentioned at the very beginning this Ohlone man who said we're at the point of first contact, and you explained what that means and how that's kind of rumbled down on through the centuries in our relationship with the indigenous people of this land. What would it take in order to repair that?
Yeah, I should correct this. Actually, it's Greg Castro is a Salinan person. It may also additionally be Ohlone a bit, but I want to make sure to give attribution for that. What would it take to make repair for that? Well, quite a lot. I think that there's never going to be a perfect or complete repair for the really difficult last 5 centuries of colonialism in the Americas and enslavement of people. However, I think that it would be fantastic to have, speaking as a US citizen, a national process of something analogous perhaps to the truth and reconciliation process that's happened in South Africa and other places, of actually facing that this nation was founded on the double genocides toward Native people and African people, and to put the full resources and weight of reparations and tangible repairs, repatriation of land, redistribution of resources behind that effort, and to have, of course, more Indigenous, Black, etc. leadership. And it's a sustained generational process of tracking toward repair and foregrounding the voices of Indigenous people, Black people, etc., in what those repairs need to look like, so that it's not some replication of the pattern by saying, as European colonialists, we're going to decide what repair looks like and dictate that to you. But showing up and saying, I have the will and the wish to participate in things being better, let's move from here. That's a good start. Like the willingness and the appreciation of the depth of the trouble, and being in a stance of real solidarity and recognizing that everybody has their own ancestral complexity we're coming from. There's no perfect, like, good people, bad people, victims, victimizers in an absolute way. So we come with that humility and complexity and say, well, I'm going to show up. Like, what's it look like today? It's not going to all happen in this lifetime, but how do I sign up for at least the rest of my life to start with, to be a participant in that? I think we can do that. A lot of people already are living that, of course. Yeah.
Yeah, you have a phrase that you use in your book, ancestor ego inflation. Like, my people are better than your people, and therefore I get to think that I'm better than you.
Well, yeah, a lot of the cultural troubles that we might talk about are some version or another of supremacy, whether it's patriarchy or male supremacy or nationalism or classism, different kinds of exploitative systems. But racism is essentially ancestral supremacy. It's like saying my ancestors are better than your ancestors in some fundamental way, or quietly think that and disguise it in all kinds of other ways, systemic ways. So the fundamental confusion is the arrogance of you taking your psychological inflation, your ego inflation, and rather than saying I'm the best, you're saying, well, I'm just a humble member of the best group of people. it's the same process. You just disguised the inflation or the arrogance in a larger identity. It happens all the time. It happens also with, people who have very similar views say, well, like anarchists are the best, or radical leftists are the best, or whatever. If you think your group is fundamentally better than other human beings on some level, then that's worth taking a hard look at. If you feel passionately about your views, that's different. There's not a need to denigrate or look down on others in order to be passionate about our convictions and values. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about place, people's relationship with place, because of course that's a huge part of Radical Joy for Hard Times, is that
Sure.
that wounded places create wounded people, and the other way around as well. How
Yeah.
to what extent does the place of the lineage play in your work?
A lot, usually. There's so much in that question around belonging and land, and the ancestral medicine and my teachings. I end up working with people from lots of backgrounds, and over the years, at least, I've done a lot of work with people of settler colonialist ancestries, especially in the U.S. and Canada, and then Australia, New Zealand, South Africa to a lesser degree, and in witnessing my own life and others who are down lineage from that kind of occupation of land, the wound around belonging and welcome is really deep and really complicated, and it's a mess to work with. I mean, I sat in ceremony in a few years back in Melbourne, is traditional Wurundjeri land in Australia, and had the good fortune for Auntie Irene and Diane in the Wurundjeri community to offer a welcome to country ceremony. I requested that, and they were willing, and it was very gracious, and something that some of the Aboriginal communities there offer. And in that offering that they gave, in one moment, one of the elders basically said, "Hey, we welcome you, Daniel, and your people here. Like, don't mess it up. Or I know you're here to do some stuff. Like, it's not a blank check, but our people welcome your people here." And it impacted me in a strong, subtle kind of way that helped me to recognize I've never, ever felt that in North America. And I'm not entitled to it. And I don't know that it will ever be extended per se. In some ways, when you're showing up through in the larger pattern of historical harm, there's a need almost to earn a welcome. And so when we enact, and I say we, meaning me and my people, when there's an enacting of harm, then it impacts our sense of felt belonging and welcome with the land. And that has all kinds of problematic reverberations. People who don't feel owned by the land and claimed by the land and don't know themselves as an extension of the earth where they're at tend to behave badly and make less responsible choices politically, etc. I worked at it when I lived in the Bay Area in California. And, of course, that's where we met, Trevi, and I did a lot of ritual for like the 11 years I was there, out on the land with the mountains and the waters and all the creatures, and like a lot of ritual out on the land, place-focused ritual. And at the end of that, I felt a real sense of belonging there. I felt like I'd worked at it, and I learned that it's possible as a settler to arrive at a kind of a sense of being owned by the land. Like I had earned a sense of belonging, something, not in an entitled way, but something I'd worked at relationally. And so then when I moved, it was very jarring to move to North Carolina. And this one thing the spirits have said to me about it also is they're like, hey, don't be too hard on yourself. Humans go through cycles. Not all humans historically stay put. People move around. People have a summer camp and a winter camp. It's cyclic. Like you might be rooted for a while, and then you're in another place and you respect that place and you're less rooted. and that's okay. And then you move around again. And so part of what is interesting to me is, how do we cultivate a sense of belonging in place when it's actually a minority of people on earth who are in the same place, anchored in, and going to really like follow the template of settled indigeneity over generations. A lot of people are moving around, or have a lot of historical mess that they're dragging along with them, or they're refugees, or they love where they're at, but they just can't stay because they can't afford it, or, you know, it's complicated, right? So a last thought is, one of the ways we can approach belonging when it's not so straightforward like that, is to say, me and my ancestors as a group acknowledge who all is here: the ancestors of this land, the living representatives, the elder deities whose bodies are the land. Like, we just say hello. That moment of first contact needs to happen. Yeah.
Yeah. Harriet, do you have some questions for Daniel?
Yeah, well, I was just going to pop into that particular point and say that that's very much very interesting to me, and that's very much where I work with people who perhaps don't feel that belonging. And what you said before about everybody can belong. It's like, nobody, you don't have to have a magic sort of superpowers to be able to connect to the ancestors. And it's exactly the same with land. But people don't realize that, especially when they're displaced, or especially when they feel that perhaps they have you know, a lineage that means that there should be a dissonance. And it's actually about, I would suggest, and maybe the question that arises is about ritual, and about giving practices for those individuals to say, well, this is the land in which I find myself. How do we bear witness to that land, and then open up those conversations that the land can bear witness to us? And what would ritual look like for that? I mean, in Radjoy, we have a ritual for that, to give it a name of ritual, where we make the beautiful bird or whatever. And it gives a belonging, usually in a wounded landscape. But what I find is that it really helps with belonging. It really helps when the wound is within and the land is there as a communicative place. So yeah, what would you say about ritual in that sort of circumstance?
Yeah, it's one of the fundamental things that I teach to, and I'm spending my life with, is teaching ritual fundamentals. And what I found with that, or at least my approach, is to not necessarily teach one scripted set ritual, but to say, here's the underlying principle of offerings, of invocation, of attunement with the powers, of gratitude, or, you know, whatever the the ritual need might be. And to say, these are the common elements that go into invocation. Here are some ways you might approach it, and try them on. Like, there's not one set way to do it. And one of the ritual can be so many things, but one of the functions of ritual, at least from an animist or earth honoring perspective, is to get the lines of communication open between you and the other than humans, between you and the ancestors, between you and, you know, God, or even just other living people who where things are stuck. And so in that way, it's very pragmatic. Whatever works and whatever helps to activate the sense of real connection is the way to go with ritual, because some people have that very innately, and those pathways are already open. Like, they don't need to necessarily do a ritual. Somebody else might need to do something very elaborate to arrive at the same pathway of open connection. But learning how to recognize and kindly assess the rituals we're doing, and to notice, is this achieving what we set out to achieve? Is it actually resulting in a sense of connection? And if so, what needs to happen then tends to unfold pretty organically from that sense of connection. Of course, one of the ritual skills is to regulate intensity a bit. So you don't want to open things up so much that your whole nervous system is blown out and you're underwater and you don't know what to do. for most people, it's more about opening up enough just to get the feeling and the strong energy moving. But yeah, doing ritual with the land in an outer way is going to vibrate stuff within us, because we're also the land. There's no nature, there's no ultimate like dichotomy between humans and nature. And so we're working with the other than humans, and like the ones whose bodies are the earth or the waters and stones, and that lights up stuff within us as well, because we're tinkering with the system that we're also made of.
Yeah. A few minutes ago, when you were talking about how the Wurundjeri people said, they were so welcoming to you, they said, do what you do, but just be respectful. It seemed like, and you said, I've never gotten that here. And it seemed like there was a real kind of a sorrow in you when you said that. How is that manifested, and what would you like to have happen that would be different?
On a practical level, I want to move to Europe, but that's kind of a cop-out. And it's not a straightforward solution anyways, but yeah, of course there's a sadness about it. I mean, I feel like a lot of my own ancestors unknowingly participated in a large scale curse that functionally a curse, you could say, or a harm that hasn't been addressed, which functions as a curse through the occupation of land and enslavement. And what I would like to see happen, of course, is the systemic repairs and change. That's the only thing that's what will ultimately be good also for the souls, if you will, of the white people, is to participate in the corrective systemic healing and repair that's needed in the Americas to address the heavy human overlay. And it doesn't mean that we can't thrive and have really awesome resourced lives in the meantime, but there's a certain like culture or collective troubles tax that is just levied against our energy bodies. And once we open up to the ancestral field, it's like, oh, well, there's all this unhealed mess. Interesting. How do I stand in relation to that? I can no longer pretend like it isn't happening. I still need to have my individuality and my joy and parent and have my life and not entirely be defined by that. But it's not an option to opt out of it. It's not actually a stance of solidarity or recognizing I'm part of it, to just disregard the need for collective repair. And so I wish there were more of that happening on a systemic level, but there's a lot of folks who are leaning in, and may that become the majority.
Yeah, let's
hope. Well, go ahead, Harriet.
Well, I was just going to ask you maybe about the Mount Umunhum. Is that how you pronounce it?
Umunhum, yeah, Mount Umunhum, yeah.
Because that sounds a little bit like that kind of ongoing ritual project of healing the land and healing ancestors and healing community, which actually then had a very, very positive outcome, because it managed to attract the funding that was required for quite significant work. Would you like to tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, in 2009, I believe it was, I was guiding a series of land-oriented ritual in the South Bay of the California, San Francisco Bay Area, in the Guadalupe River watershed. And that watershed is, or drainage is, also the site of the largest mercury mine in North America historically, in the Almond and Quicksilver County Park is what it is now. And so there's a lot of pollution in the bay from the residual pollution from that mercury that was mined during the gold rush, and which is a very difficult time for indigenous peoples in California. So there's a lot of pain collectively in the land and desecration. And one of the sacred mountain, or the tallest mountain in that area, Mount Umunhum, is sacred of course, to the Ohlone peoples of the area, different Ohlone groups. And in seeking to just greet the spirit or the spirits within or spirit of that mountain, the working ritual group at the time that I was guiding, it seemed like there was a real need to go slowly and establish trust. We did cleanups along the Guadalupe River. We did ritual honorings and offerings. We did, probably 30 different days almost of ritual in the year, and in a concentrated area. And it felt like gradually there was a sense of trust that was emerging. And partway through that year, finally, after years of effort, the funding from the Obama stimulus plan at the time allowed for the cleanup of the summit, because the summit itself of the mountain is historically desecrated from old Air Force base. And it was very exciting for that to happen in the same year of ritual. And it felt like we received it as an encouragement to continue with what we were doing. And then later, in the intent to have a restored sort of park or visitor center at the peak, I received, which is rare for me, like a very strong, like waking intuitive kind of message to act on the proposal that there be some kind of ritual area or sacred space up there. And so I put together a proposal that I also ran by some of the Ohlone folks that I was in contact with at the time, and got signatures for it, and basically said, hey, folks in charge of this mid-pen open space, please bring in Ohlone people, and we encourage you to work with them to have a really intentional, well done sacred space, visitor center, whatever they need up there. And so I took action on that, and it was, to my surprise, it was well received. And I was able, and I wasn't involved with the process much beyond that. Of course, the Ohlone leadership did what they were going to do. And I was delighted to return years later, I think maybe 2013 or no, it was later, to actually visit the ceremonial site on top of the mountain, which is rare for a publicly owned place to include a site for ceremony, and to see the mountain being honored in that way. And it was a teaching for me about listening to the ways that the land will guide you if you show up and make space for those relationships to unfold. And you show up over time. And it's not the best way or the only way to do it, but it's a way of relating with land that really can only unfold, I think, if you're staying put somewhere over some period of time, showing up for the relationships with the other than humans, and willing to allow your choices to be guided and influenced by them. And that is a kind of intimacy that a lot of us crave. It is available to, I think, most anyone who will actually show up and listen. Yeah.
I'm going to guess that your relationship with your ancestors, I mean, I should imagine that they're quite happy that you're doing this work, and that was so inspired by them. What is your kind of like day-to-day relationship with these ancestors? How do they guide you?
A lot of it feels like they're guiding me through the form of our 1- and 4-year-old daughters, to just be like, hey, I need you over here, do this, do that. And so that's, there's that. And I think the ancestors per se are sympathetic to that pull on my attention. And, it's relationships are unpredictable. And sometimes, you find a groove, and then the spirits, the ancestors, because of course I continue to relate with my ancestors. I'm also an initiate in Yoruba tradition, so I'm in relationship with some of the Òrìṣà and some other not only blood ancestral powers. And sometimes, your life's going in a certain direction, and they're like, oh, why don't you turn right? And okay, I guess we're gonna go over here and do this. So even like the new course through Ancestral Medicine, the Initiation's Life of Ritual course, I sat down to confirm a totally different plan for the year, and had a really sideways, confusing divination process that wound me up at this idea of doing the course as it now has opened for registration. I'm like, what? I'm going to teach to that, and it's going to look like this. I hadn't expected any of that. So part of it is, like any relationship, we show up with a certain idea of how it's going to go, and then allow for some influence, hold our center, and know that like through that conversation, we might end up somewhere very different. And so the main thing that occurs to me to say is the cost of staying in a relationship with them is continuing to be open to their influence. And that doesn't mean I can't say no, but I'm listening still. Yeah.
Yeah, great. So I'm going to turn it over to Harriet again in a minute to ever any final questions, because I know she's planning on taking one of your courses coming up. But I have a question about your animism, your practical animism work. And when I was reading over your website the other day, you talked about considering the personhood of organisms, microorganisms, and I couldn't help but think about the coronavirus, which isn't exactly an organism, but kind of.
Yeah,
I think it's kind of a half organism, not a full organism. But anyway, so what have you worked with the coronavirus, and what's that been like?
No, is the short answer. And I hope to keep not working with that one. We've been fortunate so far as I know, to have not yet gotten that one in a more direct way. But I would refer folks to the work of Dr. Shiv Watkins with microanimism, who's a
Shiv Watkins,
yeah,
S-H-I-V?
Siobhan, or so Sibhan, I think,
Oh,
and Siobhan. But anyways, Shiv Watkins, Dr. Shiv Watkins, and Microanimism is the site. But she's a colleague and friend and a microbiologist who teaches a lot to this terrain. But I see the microorganisms in general, like any other kind of person, as not inherently being friendly or compatible with humans one way or another. I think the vast majority of them are not spending their days thinking about humans in the same way that we're not spending our days usually thinking about them. And so it's important to approach with discernment. Is it possible to engage with the big spirit or the sentience of someone like the coronavirus, the one whose body is that virus? Yeah, it's possible. It's just something. Are you sure you know what you're doing? That's kind of like that comes up as a question.
Interesting.
Now having said that, I think it's different if you happen to be currently, let's say, infected with that one, or have had an experience of direct encounter. If there's a big, complicated, potentially hazardous force that comes into your world, the etiquette of saying, hey, you seem to be inhabiting this body now, that's different than going in search of the thing, as I see it. And what to say, it's important for folks who are reclaiming a framework for relating with the other than humans to not have the view that spirituality per se equals safe or loving or comfortable necessarily. I mean, you can relate directly with different kinds of spiritual forces, or unseen forces, which would be happy for you to suffer and die slowly. Most of them aren't like that, but there are forces in the universe like that. It's just the bigger ecology of what is. May we not call that into our world? It's not, nobody's rooting for that. But it's important to say, I want to align with compassion and wisdom and love and kindness. These are my values. That's what I want to call in. I know there are things in the world that are other than that. May they find peace. And if I encounter them, well, let us be nuanced, because, it's tricky. It's tricky to interact with such forces and to not become those things, and to not other them so much that you're in this righteous, good, bad binary. And so how we navigate with so-called evil or things that we feel threatened by, I'm not suggesting coronavirus is evil, it's just threatening to us. But how we navigate with real danger is a very interesting, very important topic that requires a lot of care and humility.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Thank you. And I actually know somebody who ran a holistic education center and didn't want to get the vaccine. And she told me that she was in communication with the virus and it was gonna, she was like negotiating with it to leave her alone, and she ended up dying from it. So I wonder if, what you just said kind of puts that into a whole different perspective for me.
Yeah. I mean, it's such a very polarized topic, but I've spoken out and been appreciative of vaccine technology, and I'm very in favor of doing what we each can to contribute to collective safety, knowing that different bodies have different needs and parameters. And so, yeah, I don't have any righteousness left on that particular topic. It's been so exhaustingly divisive. Not saying you're coming with that, of course, but I don't see, there's no such thing as nature that's separate from us. And in that way, vaccine technology is not unnatural any more than the antibiotics that I took when I had dysentery that saved my life. And they're clever human things that we need to be judicious with and, mindful of their impact. But the whole natural unnatural split is conceptually problematic, and it kind of comes out of this idea of like humans bad, nature good. So natural things are good, human made things are bad, and that is a dichotomy or a binary that is actually really hazardous to perpetuate.
It's actually, there's a third part to that, which is the cycle going round, which is maybe humans are bad, nature is good, but humans are, conquer all, and it's all about the humans. And I think that really the animist narrative that you're talking about, that I hear, is we don't know and we're not at the top of the pile. And so let's within the wisdom that we have, our ancestors that also were extraordinary and gave us medicines, they are all part of us learning how to be in this body right now, as well as how we've evolved with different pathogens.
There are some analogies, just to close out that thread. There are some similarities. If we think about how do white people, let's say, become less annoyingly racist, one of the ways to think about that progression is becoming a regular sized person, where you're not, of course, you're not the arrogant white people are better, hazardous, racist person in that way. But when you're like, oh, white people are bad, I have cultural shame and low self-esteem, and there's kind of a caved in sense of your identity, it's still white centering. Mm-hmm. You're still sucking the air out of the room by focusing on yourself. And you have not yet achieved, may it happen, being a regular sized person who is situated in a certain place and lineage, who has inherited certain ancestral debts and obligations that hopefully motivate you to participate as a good, as a person in solidarity, all that. So you want to, like, the idea is to become just a regular sized person. And humans as a species have often inherited this anthropocentrism or human supremacy. And then in trying to heal that, we can end up in humans are bad, humans are a virus contaminating the earth. It's the inverse of that. It's still human centering. It's not like, hey, humans are complicated, kind of dangerous, kind of awesome and beautiful, lovable, tricksy kind of primate. Watch out for them, get to know them first. So that's like a more honest assessment. Yeah.
And just to wrap it up, there's two threads, I think, to this, which we could talk for hours, but I'm conscious that we've only got the hour. One of the threads is returning back to wounded land, what you were talking about, like wounded ancestry and all those sort of things, and how that can be read out into a difficult landscape, and how we assess the risk and go forth in a witnessing that is compassionate to self as well as to the land. But the thing that I'd love to move into a little bit about what you're saying about just turning into a regular sized human is more into the family constellations and the family ritual work that you're doing. As a parent myself, I've got 3 children, and it is so easy. My husband's been working on a project for a long time now, so I'm sort of single parent mindset. It's very easy to just sort of play the authority role, you know, off I go, here, do as you're told. But actually what we've got together is this kind of we're sort of just messing as it goes. And so I'd love you to talk a little bit about ritual within that, and how we work with responsibility, how we work with having a little bit of foresight. You know, I've been a kid, I've been a teen. How do we work within that and honor their own line as they grow? And then just maybe going right back to what you said before about how your ancestors are showing up in your children. And so sort of timey-wimey, going in on itself, turning in on itself is happening. And where would ritual help with that? You know, because I'm sure that a lot of people who are listening to this are parents, and so it would be wonderful to as a ritualist myself, I know that it's very beneficial. So perhaps you could talk a little bit about that.
There's so much, really. I mean, how do we bring a ritual sensibility to the tremendous responsibility of raising small humans? A few things, a few principles to name. One is to recognize that each of the humans we're caring for has their own specific destiny, their own specific gifts and needs. And at least from a Yoruba perspective, we would say their own taboos, the things that are really going to be bad medicine for them if they do, or you know, whatever, things to avoid. And trying to understand the specific soul level needs of our children, knowing that they're going to be different than the other children, that helps a lot. And it's different. Even the most progressive, awesome, useful advice on how to parent tends to come in the form of generally parent all the people you parent in these ways. It isn't recognizing that one fundamental style might work better for one, and a whole different set of like rules and other style might work better for somebody else. And that has to be squared with your own destiny and your own needs and like your own settings, right? You have to be yourself in an authentic way. Another thing I'd say is that kids learn through watching what you do, at least as much as what you say. And so besides ideally having those two things be congruent, because they'll pick up on the gaps right away if they're not, model ritual for them, model talking to the earth, to the deities, to the ancestors, and doing strange ritual things and sprinkling, you know, milk and water and offerings in the garden to make it grow, or, you know, things that are like clearly ritual behaviors. And so they can see that that's just what grown-ups do. That's a normal thing. And adults relate with the invisible, sometimes invisible powers that hold the world together. Cool. That's part of learning to be an adult. So I need to see that, because there will be a tremendous amount of pressure to reject that. Our 4-year-old this morning over waffles was like, telling Sarah, my wife, she's like, Mommy, do you know that the sun and the earth and houses are also people, and that they can be sad too? It's like, yeah, okay. And I'm just thinking like, and I even said to her this morning, not everyone understands that.
Mm.
Like, in other words, like the conditioning of colonialism and reductionistic materialism is coming for you. Get ready. Yeah.
Beautiful. Yeah. So we have only a couple minutes left. Do we have any questions, Harriet, from people listening?
We haven't. We have comments as we've gone. There's been a few comments and just saying, yeah, that was a really important thing to say, and thanks for that. And you know, just reiterating what you've said. So, but please do. What happens is this stays up on the Radjoy Facebook page, and it's also available on YouTube. So anytime you ever want to go on it and just have a look, you're most welcome to. But nothing at the moment.
Great.
So Daniel, would you just like to just conclude by telling everyone, the name of your book again and your website and maybe what's coming up for in your courses?
Yeah, the organization is ancestralmedicine.org. And we have online classes. There's a class open, 2 classes open now, one on practical animism and the other initiations, a life of ritual. And that's a year series that both of those begin in May. And there's a ritual this Sunday for parents that's free and open to everybody. So there's a lot of resources, a lot of ways to engage there. There's also a directory of over 50 practitioners who've completed their certification in guiding ancestral healing work for others. And so that work's available, I believe, in 9 languages so far. And the book's been translated into a few languages. And so it is part of my ethic and our organization's ethic that the work be international and rooted in an ethic of what we could say is anti-supremacy, or proactively addressing historical harms and injustices, and just accessible to people and from a kind place. So that's where I'm coming from, is to help people who haven't had a framework for how to engage with the ancestors and the earth and ritual, to reclaim that framework in a way that's non-dogmatic and good for their life. And so if that's something that's of interest, it's available, it's doable. Yeah.
Daniel Foor, thank you so much for being with us.
Yeah.
Wonderful conversation, and your work is really incredible. So good
Thank you
luck,
both.
and may all the lands welcome you in your work. And
thank you both. Yeah.
Yeah,
All
thank
right.
you. Yeah, and just to reiterate that, and how timely it is, and very gratefully received. So thank you. So we have drunk our teas, we have drunk our hot chocolates, and the fire has died down, and it's time to think about leaving the cafe. And before we do, we turn to the north and we thank the Great Bear for the wisdom of peace and calm and expectation in the gaps between just waiting, grounding, giving us the peace of the earth. Thank you. We turn to the west, to the water, where the great salmon of wisdom has given us wisdom of our ancestors that have helped us to feel that we have carried on their work in some small way in our small conversation today. Thank you. And to the south, the great stag that inspired us, gave us the fire in our bellies of what really pushes us and inspires us in our work. Thank you. And to the east, the hawk that gave us inspiration, clarity of vision, and the words to express ourselves. Thank you. And so the circle is uncast, and we are ready to leave the cafe. And as the last person leaves, we turn the light out and shut the door for another month. So thank you, everybody who's been here. Thank you to Daniel and to Trebi, and see you all next month.
thank you. Thank you both.
Thanks.